They came for our servers first, not the weapons depots, not the command infrastructure, not the orbital defense platforms still half-assembled above Nairobi and Sao Paulo. The Verath arrived in their cathedral ships, and they went straight for the data centers. 6 simultaneous strikes on 4 continents, each one clinical, each one precise, each one timed to the second. It was the first thing about them that scared us more than the ships themselves. Mireille Okonkwo understood what it meant before the generals did. She was 31 years old and had spent the last 8 years as a data archivist for the European Consolidated Memory Project, cataloging the digital remnants of private lives. The photographs, the voice notes, the shopping lists and boarding passes, and late-night camera rolls of 200 million people who had trusted the cloud with the soft underbelly of their existence. She was not a soldier. She had never wanted to be. But she was sitting in the Ekamp substation outside Lyon when the first strike hit the Zurich hub. And she watched on her monitor as 43 petabytes of human memory simply stopped existing. She sat very still for a long moment. Outside, the November sky had turned the color of old pewter. Then she started working. The Verath communication that arrived 6 hours later was transmitted in a frequency humans had only recently learned to decode, and it said, in essence, stop. It said, cease resistance and you will be preserved as a biological curiosity. It said, your information architecture has been neutralized. You have nothing left with which to coordinate, to plan, to remember who you were before us. The message was sent in 14 languages simultaneously, which the generals took as a gesture of contempt. Mireille took it as a gesture of profound misunderstanding. She had been awake for 19 hours by then. Her coffee had gone cold. There was a photograph pinned above her workstation of her grandmother, standing in front of a bus in Lagos in 1974, squinting into the sun with her hand raised against the glare, laughing at something out of frame. The photograph had no metadata, no geotag, no timestamp more precise than the year, no face recognition anchor. It was just light caught on film, then scanned, then uploaded, then carried across 30 years of technology into this concrete room where Mireille looked at it every day before she started work. She understood something the Verath didn't. Memory was not infrastructure. The Verath were a species of extraordinary collective intelligence, and their great error, the error that would eventually cost them everything, was that they experienced no meaningful distinction between data and memory. For them, information lived in systems. It was indexed, retrieved, overwritten, purged. Their own history was stored in crystalline lattices aboard their ships, perfectly organized, perfectly accessible, and perfectly brittle in ways they had never needed to discover. When they destroyed a data center, they believed they were destroying human memory. It was like burning a library and believing you had burned every story ever told inside it. Mireille had spent 8 years learning what people actually kept. Not everything. Never everything. People were selective in ways that defied prediction. They kept the blurry photograph from a school trip in 2009 but deleted the sharp one taken a moment later. They kept voice messages from the dead long after they could no longer listen to them. They kept the grocery lists that had somehow accrued meaning and discarded the careful records they had meant to maintain. The archive that Mireille had spent her career cataloging was not the totality of human experience. It was the sentimental residue, the stubborn, irrational, non-systematic preservation of moments that had mattered to someone once. She built her proposal in 6 hours and presented it to the emergency council at dawn. The council was 7 people in a bunker under the Alps, running on 3 hours of sleep and terrible coffee. The projection screens behind them showed the Verath fleet redistributing above the Atlantic. General Haas kept touching the side of his neck, where his earpiece had been before the communications blackout. Ambassador Ferreira from Brazil hadn't spoken in 20 minutes and was staring at the middle distance in a way that Mireille recognized as either deep thought or incipient shock. The distributed recall network, she said, and pulled up her schematic. It was not a new technology. The hardware had been sitting in storage for years, developed during the last pandemic for exactly this kind of decentralized scenario. Small nodes, civilian grade, able to run on backup power, designed to share fragments of information laterally, rather than pulling from a central source. The Verath had targeted hubs. They had not targeted the capillaries. And human beings, it turned out, had been building capillaries their entire digital lives. You want us to use personal photo archives, General Haas said. in the tone of a man hearing something for the first time that he is not sure is brilliant or insane. "I want us to use what people kept when they had nothing to gain from keeping it," Mireille said. "The Verath destroyed our institutional memory. They didn't touch our personal memory. Those are different things, and they've made the mistake of not knowing the difference." Ferreira came back from wherever he had been. "What's in those archives?" "Faces," Mireille said. "Locations. Routes people drove the same way every day for 15 years. Gathering places, buildings, the inside of every kitchen that ever had a family in it." She paused. "Maps, not official maps. The way human beings actually move through space. Where they go when they're scared. Where they go when they want to hide." The silence in the bunker lasted 7 seconds. "How long?" Haas asked. "Give me 72 hours and access to the relay network," Mireille said. "And about 6 billion personal photo archives." They gave her 96. She requisitioned a team of 43 archivists, 12 network engineers, 3 linguists, and 1 behavioral anthropologist named Dr. Priya Subramaniam, who had spent her career studying what she called the grammar of informal documentation. They worked in rotating shifts, 12 hours on and 4 off, in a converted gymnasium in a town called Bourg-en-Bresse that the Verath hadn't bothered to target because it contained nothing of strategic value, which meant it contained exactly what Mireille needed. The nodes came online in clusters. First France, then the Iberian Peninsula, then the patchwork of surviving infrastructure across North Africa and the Middle East. Each node was seeded with fragments. Not data in the Verath sense, not indexed and searchable, but associative. The way human memory actually worked. An image of a mountain road in Kosovo was cross-referenced not by GPS coordinate, but by a photograph of the same road taken from a car window in 1998, which was linked to a video of children playing outside a school that no longer existed, which was linked to a woman's voice message left for her sister that mentioned a specific corner, a specific bakery, a smell she couldn't describe but would recognize anywhere. The Verath, monitoring human data traffic, saw noise. They were looking for the architecture they understood, the hierarchical, the indexed, the institutional. They did not recognize what they were seeing because what they were seeing was not, by their definition, an information system. It was something much older and much stranger. Dr. Subramaniam came to find Mireille on the 3rd night, around 2 in the morning, holding a tablet. Her eyes were bright in a way that sleep deprivation sometimes produced in certain kinds of people. Not the exhausted brightness, but the other kind. The kind that came from seeing something clearly. "They're going to try to cut the relay," Subramaniam said. "I know. Do you know why they haven't yet?" Mireille looked up from her screen. "They can't find the edges." Subramaniam smiled. "They can't find the edges," she agreed. "Because there aren't any. It's not a network in any sense they have a concept for. They're looking for the nodes to sever, and there are no nodes. There's just..." She turned her tablet to show a visualization of the relay traffic, which looked less like a network diagram and more like a coral reef viewed from above. Dense and irregular and apparently structureless. "This." Mireille looked at the visualization for a long moment. "Show me the density map." Subramaniam pulled it up. The highest density zones were not, as the generals had expected, clustered around former military installations or government centers. They were clustered around schools, around hospitals, around the kinds of places where people had gathered for ordinary reasons over long periods of time, and had taken photographs of each other in front of buildings and in hallways, and at birthday parties and graduations. The most photographed building in the entire relay network was a bus station in Thessaloniki that had been standing since 1965, and that thousands of people had passed through and documented in every decade since. It was, Mireille thought, a perfect fortress. Not because it was fortified, but because it was beloved. The Verath made their move on the 81st hour. It was a precise, sophisticated attempt, a signal cascade designed to overwhelm the relay frequencies and force the nodes into silence. Under a conventional network architecture, it would have worked. The Verath ran models before they deployed it, and their models told them it would work. Their models told them that the human information network had a recoverable structure, that it could be mapped, and that the cascade would sever it at 17 critical junctures simultaneously. Their models were built on their own experience of information systems. The cascade hit. For 4 seconds, 11,000 nodes went dark. Then they came back online, not from a backup server, not from a redundant system, but from the same mechanism that had always kept human memory alive in the absence of infrastructure. From the other nodes, from the associative web, from 40,000 fragments of overlapping personal archive, that all referenced each other in ways the Verath had not modeled because the Verath had not known to model the redundancy of sentiment. The stubborn insistence of people on keeping records of the same moment from slightly different angles. Mirelle heard about the Cascade's failure 6 minutes after it happened. She was in the gymnasium holding a mug of cold coffee and watching the relay visualization on the main screen. She watched the dark patches appear and then, smoothly without drama, fill back in. She thought about her grandmother outside the bus in Lagos, laughing at something out of frame. She thought about the fact that she had that photograph in 3 different places. The original scan on a drive in her apartment in Lyon, a copy in the XMP archive, and a version she had uploaded to a shared family album 13 years ago that her cousin in Abuja still had on his phone. She thought about the fact that this redundancy had never been strategic. She had never backed up that photograph because she was building a distributed memory network. She had backed it up because she was afraid of losing it. That was the thing the Verath could not model: fear of loss as infrastructure, love as a data architecture, the irrational, persistent, absolutely non-strategic human habit of keeping things because they mattered, and then keeping copies of those things. Send then those copies to other people in case they also wanted to keep them. On the 91st hour, she transmitted the first coordinated signal through the relay network. It was not a military order. It was not an evacuation directive or a weapons deployment schedule. It was a compiled archive of gathering places: parks, community centers, markets. The physical spaces that the photographs showed had been used as meeting points across decades of ordinary human life. The kind of places people went to when things were difficult. The kind of places that appeared in the background of birthday photographs and holiday snapshots and the casual, unintended documentation of lives being lived. People moved. Not in formation, not according to a military plan, but according to a pattern that the Verath fleet's targeting systems kept failing to resolve into a threat profile. The movement looked random. It wasn't. It was the deep pattern of how communities had always organized themselves before there were institutions to organize them. And it was encoded in the photographs because the photographs had always been of this: of people gathering, of people in the places they loved, of the ordinary texture of shared life that the Verath had dismissed as noise. General Haas, watching the movement patterns from the bunker, said something that he later told people he immediately regretted because it sounded like something from a film. They're using the photographs to rebuild the world. It wasn't quite right. The photographs had never stopped being the world. That was the point. The Verath fleet held position for 11 days. The crystalline memory lattices aboard their command ships were running constant analysis, trying to find the structure, trying to find the architecture of human resistance so they could target it. They were looking for the center. There was no center. There was only the distributed, associative, stubbornly irrational record of human beings paying attention to each other. The birthday photograph and the school trip and the blurry image taken from a moving car of a mountain road in winter. The voice message that still existed on a dead woman's daughter's phone. The picture of a grandmother, laughing at something out of frame, copies of which now lived on 2 continents and had been referenced by the relay network more than 9,000 times in the past 4 days as a geolocation anchor for a region of West Africa where 3 organizing points had successfully established contact. On the 12th day, the Verath withdrew to a holding orbit and requested a communication channel. The message they sent was formally worded and, between the lines, careful. They had encountered, they said, an information architecture of a type they had not previously cataloged. They wished to understand it before proceeding. They were requesting a delay in operations to allow for cultural consultation. In the bunker, someone laughed first. Then everyone laughed, a long time, the kind of laughing that had something else underneath it. Mireille was not in the bunker. She was in the gymnasium in Bourg-en-Bresse, sitting in front of her workstation, looking at the relay visualization, which had stopped looking like coral and started looking like something else. Something she couldn't name. A pattern without edges, dense and tangled and alive. She pulled up her personal archive, not the XMP archive, not the institutional records, her own, the grandmother outside the bus. Her daughter's first day of school, an image so badly framed that both their heads were cut off at the top. And Morel had kept it anyway, because in the remaining frame you could see their hands, her daughter's small hand folded inside hers. A photograph of a meal she had eaten alone at a restaurant in Marseille, on a day when she had been very unhappy and had needed to document the existence of the sea in front of her. Hundreds of images that no one had ever seen, that served no purpose, that she had kept because throwing them away had felt like a small violence against the moments they contained, she thought. The Verath built their memory to last forever and were afraid it wouldn't. We built ours to matter. Even knowing it would be lost, she thought, that's the difference. She thought, that's why we're still here. Outside the gymnasium, it had started to rain. Someone had left a coffee going, and the smell of it was moving through the building. The ordinary domestic smell of an ordinary human morning, beginning in a building full of people who had spent 4 days rebuilding the world from photographs, and were now, incrementally, beginning to sleep. Mireille saved her work. She put the visualization in a folder labeled simply with the date. She sent a copy to her cousin in Abuja with a note that just said, "We're okay." Then she sat for a while and looked at the photograph of her grandmother, still laughing at something out of frame, still squinting into a sun that had set 50 years ago, still there.